Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to have you join us with us this morning for the conversation with the Archbishop, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this morning. My name is Deborah Saffrey-Collins, and I'm the Head of Chaplaincy at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, and delighted to be with you this morning on this cool morning, but not too bad as they promised, this cool morning as we discuss this very important topic of the public purse. Not only is it my great delight to welcome the Archbishop, but also our guest speakers, Daniel Wood and Phil Dolan, who I'll introduce you to shortly. May I please acknowledge country as today we stand in footsteps millennia old. May we acknowledge the traditional owners whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since men and women awoke from the great dream. We honour the presence of these ancestors who reside in the imagination of this land and whose irrepressible spirituality flows through all creation. And I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and those gathered with us today. Danielle Wood is CEO of the Grattan Institute, where she heads a team of leading policy thinkers researching and advocating policy to improve the lives of Australians. Danielle also leads Grattan's budgets and government program and has published extensively on economic reform priorities, budgets, tax reform, women's workforce participation, generational inequality, and reforming political institutions. She is a sought-after media commentator and speaker on policy issues. Danielle was previously Principal Economist and Director of Merger Investigations at the ACCC, a Senior Economist at NERA Economic Consulting, and Senior Research Economist at the Productivity Commission. She holds an honours degree in economics from the University of Adelaide and 2 master's degrees, one in economics and one in competition law from the University of Melbourne. Danielle is a member of the Australian Government's Women's Economic Equality Task Force, the Parliamentary Budget Office Expert Advisory Committee, and the Commonwealth Bank CEO Advisory Council. She was the co-founder and first chair of the Women in Economics Network. Will you welcome Danielle, please? Professor Phil Dolan is Professor and Executive Director of the Institute for the Future of Business at the University of Melbourne. His previous roles including Acting Pro-Vice Chancellor at La Trobe University, Dean of the Business School at the University of Western Australia, and Head of the Department of Applied Finance and Actuarial Studies at Macquarie University. He has taught in the areas of investments, portfolio management, and creative problem solving. Prior to academia, he worked in the investment management arm of Macquarie Bank for more than a decade. He is also an active angel investor in and mentor to early-stage female-founded startup businesses. He has a bachelor's degree in computer science and mathematics from Macquarie University, a master's in business administration from the University of New South Wales, and a PhD in finance from Stanford. Will you make Phil welcome, please? Today, following our conversation, there will be time for questions, so I encourage you to be thinking about those as you listen to the speakers today. And I hand over now to Archbishop Philip. Thank you, Archbishop.
Thanks, Deborah, and thank you, our hardy people on arguably the coldest week, but time will tell, of Melbourne this winter. It's a good opportunity to open up some questions today, and like me, you probably sometimes wonder, is economics a science or is it a rhetorical art? We've seen in recent times I suppose you'd call it a press pile-on the Reserve Bank governor because of his forecasts about interest rates and how they didn't prove to be accurate in the way that people might have expected them to be. So economics, most of us understand our own household economics. We understand what debt feels like to us. We understand what rising interest rates feel like to us. But I just wanted to really open up the question, economics, when we talk about governments, how much is it like, but also unlike what we understand in our own domestic economy? There's Danielle. Have you got a view on that question?
Yeah, and it's a good question because it is one where I think people want to try and make that parallel with the household budget. And you're right, in some ways it is similar, in some ways it's different. So the two key ways government budgets are different to a household budget is, first of all, governments live forever. So while all of us, may take on debt at one point in our life, we know that we need to pay it back over that life cycle, whereas governments are infinitely lived, so they can continue to roll over debt. The other way in which it's a little bit different to households is that governments have more capacity to borrow things which increase their future incomes or increase incomes in the economy. So we will borrow to invest in infrastructure. We will borrow to invest in our education system or our health systems. Those things can increase our future productive capacity and make that borrowing worth it. So not only are we going to increase the size of the pie, that is going to enable us to cover the costs of that debt and add to the overall size of the pie in the economy. Households can do that to some extent. So we can think of course, a lot of people will go on to university and they'll take on a debt in order to do that. They're doing that because they believe it'll be worth it in terms of their future income. But it's just not as common for households to have those broad set of opportunities that governments have to deliver things which will boost income.
And Phil, like and unlike, how would you explain that?
Well, I agree with Danielle. It's had similarities and differences. One difference perhaps is that if I, at the household level, borrow, it's almost always to spend the money on myself or my family. One thing governments can do is borrow on behalf of others and use that money to fund services, infrastructure, various types of expenditure, sometimes with an aim of increasing equality, for example. And so, which then of course raises the risk that if you're taking money from one group and giving it to another, that can cause issues of populism, as we've seen, resentment in some cases and so on. And like all debt's just a tool. It can be used good or bad. It depends what the money is spent on. But the notion that the country should be run exactly like a family in terms of those sort of issues, I agree, doesn't apply. Particularly when there's intergenerational things. We're taking on debt to fund infrastructure that might be still used in 100 years' time. Families typically don't make those kinds of decisions, and nor should they. So yeah, there's certain similarities, but I think trying to fit it into a box where it's exactly the same as the situation would be if it was an individual family would lead you to make probably poor decisions in the long run.
Because it seems to me that where the debt is denominated, whether it's in US dollars or whether it's in local currency, you start getting questions of exchange rates and what happens to that. I suppose you've got a growing economy. There's a general hope that the size of the economy will grow to a scale where the size of the current debt becomes relatively less significant over time. And there's a lot of future kind of expectation of conditions, which, as we know, we're not always as sharp in picking that up. But the numbers we hear seem to be pretty staggering. The amount of debt, say, in the Victorian state treasury seems big. I mean, how do we, when is kind of too little debt not enough, but too much debt is kind of blindingly obvious? How do we find the sweet point of debt?
So look, I think the first thing to say is I think I'm more concerned about the dynamics of debt. And so you've got how much you owe, and then you've got where that is going. And as a general rule, when the economy is good, unemployment is low, you want to see debt stabilising or coming down. That is what gives you the scope when the economy is not good and you need to intervene to ramp up debt to deal with that. At the moment, if I look at, we'll start with the federal government and we'll talk about Victoria. Federal government net debt is about 25% of gross domestic product. It's about $600 billion. That is high by historical standards in Australia, relatively low by international standards. And many OECD nations have debt levels above 100% of GDP. Victorian debt also now kind of coming to that 25% mark, very high by historical standards. Remembering 2 election cycles ago, we were talking about whether we should increase the debt cap from 6%. Now it's going to be nudging 25%. So we have had a very steep ramp up, and it's still growing. So I think that is generally what concerns us. Why does it matter when debt keeps growing? First of all, you start to pay more on your borrowings, and the literature and the real life experience is very clear on that. At higher debt levels, borrowers are increasingly going to demand a premium, and that means that the amount of government money that is servicing that debt, coming out of your budget just to pay the interest costs, starts to increase over time. The second reason you might care, and that point you're talking about, is there a sort of threshold that you start worrying about? There is evidence, sort of global evidence, that once you are getting to debt levels 75 to 100% of GDP in that range, it does start to create a drag on economic growth. And that's partly because you're just paying so much in interest that's not going into other productive things. It can be because you're having to raise more taxes in order to cover that. That's providing a drag on the economy. So it certainly seems that there is some sort of threshold point. We aren't near that, but that's not to say that we shouldn't be worrying about the fact that while the economy is relatively good, debt is continuing to creep up, because if that's your dynamics, you're just going to see it continue to grow.
And Phil, is there any significant or material difference between debt held by the federal government and that's contained in the individual states? Is that a meaningful distinction?
Yeah, I think it is. Federal government can obviously borrow on much more favourable terms than any individual state, and also it prints the currency, so has that ability as well. The notion that the federal government would ever go broke doesn't really apply. At the state level, though, that there are other constraints. The states are much more constrained in terms of how they can raise revenue with the various taxes and so on. And over the years, there's been attempts to try and fix some of those federalism issues. Unfortunately, they almost always require all the states to agree, and getting that to happen is virtually impossible for reasons that wouldn't surprise people. As you heard in my bio, I lived in Western Australia for a while. Was at the business school there. They've had a terrific run lately because of very high commodity prices. Terms of trade have been excellent. Everything has kind of fallen into place for them. And so they've actually been running surpluses, which is fantastic for WA. Hasn't been the case in other parts of Australia. And one of the problems you have with the federal structure we have is that if the Reserve Bank, for instance, are trying to rein in inflation by raising interest rates, higher interest rates might make perfect sense in some parts of the country, but not in others. If they're going through different stages of their economic cycles, you don't have the ability to fine-tune it at that level. So the states then may have to take on more debt than they would otherwise prefer, because their own state-level issues are quite different to the rest of the country. So you can run into problems where there's a mismatch, essentially, between overall fiscal and monetary policy at the federal level and at the individual states. So the states are kind of boxed in a little bit to some extent. Just on Daniela's other point, I think it's worth noting that you would hope that when economic times are really good and you do have the ability to run surpluses, you'd be paying debt down and then taking on debt when you need to, as the cycle kind of turns against you. One of the things that countries around the world, and Australia's no exception, have fallen into the trap that they seem to run deficits regardless. It's a long time since we've had budget surpluses at the federal level in Australia, for instance. And the risk with that is you take on too much debt, it then really constrains your ability to take on significantly more when you really need to, when the economic situation is not good. Australia went into COVID in pretty good shape in that regard, with debt levels by world standards at pretty good levels, and we were able to take on significant amount and cushion a lot of the negative consequences. Other countries didn't quite have that flexibility. But I would be trying to get that situation under control as quickly as possible. You don't want to set a new benchmark for what's acceptable levels of debt based on a 1 in a 100-year event like a pandemic.
And just while we're putting some of these building blocks in place, as I understand it, the Reserve Bank has quite a limited mandate as to what it is to focus on. So you've got a Reserve Bank operating that's controlling some aspects of economic policy, but then you've got effectively the government through the Treasurer bringing down a budget and having other influences. Just what do you observe about, I suppose, the mandate of the Reserve Bank, and is it something that will, is it going to be fit for purpose as we go into the future, or is it something that will be, because we're talking about, you know, if you don't like what Phil Lowe has done, that maybe he shouldn't be reappointed, but I think it's probably more to do with the terms of what the actual entity has to do. But do you want to comment on that first, Danielle?
Yeah, very, very happy to. And of course, we've just had a very big review of the Reserve Bank and its mandate and other issues, which largely...
Well, just tell us what its mandate is for everyone to know.
I mean, its mandate, it has a dual mandate, effectively, which is to focus on inflation and employment. So it needs to balance those two issues. We think of it as very focused on inflation, and I think that's fair, and certainly that is the challenge that it is dealing with right now, as we know. And you know, what the review found was that was appropriate. Remembering that the Reserve Bank essentially has one tool, which is moving the cash rate up and down. It makes sense for it to focus on that narrow mandate. The bigger question, though, I think you're raising is what is the role of government and fiscal policy or budgets in complementing or supplementing the work that Reserve Bank does, and that is the very live issue at the moment. So we have inflation that is just far too high to be comfortable with. The Reserve Bank is responding as it should with its tool by cranking up the cash rate. That is hitting a segment of the population, largely those with higher levels of household debt. But what we don't want is the federal or state governments pushing in the opposite direction and making their job harder. So when governments are running budget deficits, they're adding more to the economy than they're putting in. They're actually adding demand at the time the Reserve Bank is trying to take it away. So I think, you know, the federal government has been relatively restrained. I will say, you know, that we are expected to have a budget surplus this year. That was helped by big commodity price windfalls, most of which were banked, but not all. So could it have been more disciplined? Yes, it could. We had a pre-election budget last year, which was quite stimulatory. Remember, it rolled out an additional set of tax offsets, which was not the right time to be doing that. So, you know, overall, federal government probably hasn't helped. But the bigger policy question is, should it do something more significant to work with the RBA in times of high inflation? So examples might be increasing the superannuation guarantee. In certain periods when inflation is above a threshold, that means more is going to come out of your pay packet, slowing demand, trying to take consumption out of the economy, but it will go into your future savings. Should they increase the GST? Again, you know, trying to cut down the amount of money that's floating around the economy. So there's a broad debate, and this is an international debate, about whether there are mechanisms you can build into budget policy around taxes and spending that are going to mean we're not trying to do it all through this interest rate mechanism, which works, but it works by hitting one particular group very, very hard. This is about, can we spread the distribution of that impact, of that burden of trying to bring down inflation?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think you really like all arms of government and policy working in the same direction. As soon as they're not, you run the risk that they just take offsetting actions and we don't make any progress. I think on the other point that Danielle made that I think is a really good one is things like increasing the GST. You know, the steps you could take that most economists would agree are probably a good thing to do. The problem is we're in a situation now where almost any change is going to have winners and losers, and it's always very easy to identify the losers and get them to agitate against what you're proposing. The famous American economist Thomas Sowell, well into his 90s now, once said in economics and government, there are no solutions, there's only trade-offs. All the easy solutions have been found long ago. You now have to make trade-offs, and that requires politicians sometimes to be brave about things. The trouble is being brave isn't a good way to get yourself re-elected. And I think we've seen a stagnation in terms of major policy changes, which most economists would agree are probably a good thing. The problem is it's always easy to identify someone who, as a result of those changes, will be worse off, even if the economy generally and most people are better off. And therefore it's easy to argue against them if you don't want to see them happen. Increasing the GST would be a good example. So I think, unfortunately, we've got a bit of timidity amongst the policymakers, and that throws even more back onto the Reserve Bank, which, as Danielle says, has only really got one lever they can pull. They've been pulling that lever pretty hard, but they really didn't have any choice. And I think also I agree with her that means the pain is not necessarily equally distributed. Higher interest rates are just going to redistribute money from borrowers to the lenders. And over the cycle, you'd hope those kind of things would balance out. But the situation we're in at the moment, there's nothing on the horizon that's going to change things, I don't think, other than just keep jacking interest rates up until inflation is back where they want it.
Because it seems to me, just hearing as you're speaking, that you've got a long run of some of these consequences that about debt. Some of them, potentially will affect people not yet born, because there'll be economic circumstances that they inherit because of the fact of decisions now. But we've got a relatively short political cycle where naturally you start getting the analogy of good domestic management being used by federal politicians, and I think people will be very sensitive to the impact of budget policy on their own circumstances. So just if we kind of transition a little bit into thinking, what is kind of all the endless things, because it seems to me, as you hear it, there's always, almost like on a daily or a weekly basis, very big claims on public expenditure. There's, and they each seem convincing to the people putting them forward. How do you distinguish between these kind of claims? Because it's not unending. The debt just can't. You can't keep borrowing to meet expectation, or do we, Danielle?
Well, look, you've put your finger on what I would say has been the fundamental disconnect in fiscal policy over the past decade. And this is a slow burn issue. This is not about what happened during COVID. This is community expectations of government have increased. So we have seen a number of areas of social spending, whether it be aged care. We looked at the terrible way in which people were being treated in facilities and said, we don't like that. We need to spend more. I personally think that's the right call. We've looked at disability and saw that we didn't have a good scheme to protect people with serious disability, so we rolled out a national insurance scheme. We are in a sort of fragmented geopolitical environment, much more challenging perhaps than it was a decade ago, so we've increased defence spending considerably. We have an ageing population, and that comes with challenges in terms of health spending and other areas. So what we've seen is this rising pressure on the spending side of the budget, and spending has increased at a federal level by about 2% of GDP. In a structural sense, it is now 2% of GDP higher and growing fast. It's increased at a state level, I think, even more in terms of a percentage point of GSP. And yet we haven't really changed anything on the tax or revenue side. So that continues to sit at a reasonably similar percentage of the economy. So when people talk about the structural deficit, that is the structural deficit. And I think the conversation hasn't kept up with that. So what do? We have to look at areas where we think we might be spending too much. Can we spend less? Can we spend efficiently? And I've got ideas, and I'm happy to talk about those. And we need to talk about our revenue base. I think a lot of those pressures reflect community expectations. They reflect structural things like the ageing population. So inevitably the size of government will increase a bit, and therefore we have to talk about a tax base that is going to fund that level of services that the community expects and demands. So that is, to me, the core conversation in budget policy. And as I said, happy to get into details of ideas around what that looks like. But I just want to tell you those dynamics.
In a little while, because I think it makes sense to ordinary people that if you say invest in education, you're equipping people to participate and become, productive citizens, and then, through their lifetime, they'll earn money, they'll invest, they'll spend money, they'll pay taxes. So that you can understand all of that, but then there's a lot of spending which I can see why it's done, because when you go to Sydney, you can see there's lots of these magnificent underground tunnels that take the traffic out of the CBD. So you come to Melbourne, you think, well, why wouldn't we have these? This is obvious, but the numbers involved and the control over how much they cost, it seems to be a pretty big challenge. And where do these things sit? If we've got an actual fundamental change in our society about a green orientation in moving away from, say, the vehicles like we're using them now to more public transport. Phil, what do you think about this good spending or not so good spending? What's your kind of global take, and then we'll go into some of the detail after that.
No, I think things like education, most people would agree, is worth spending money on. Because for all the reasons you say, it makes for a more productive society. It lets people achieve it, whatever their potential happens to be. Danielle's point about spending on things like aged care, I think also disability insurance, things like that make a lot of sense. I think where you can run into problems is we've got a mindset where there's quite a lot of, in my view, quite a lot of middle class welfare. Providing childcare assistance to couples on family income of $500,000 is just lunacy in my view. But people at that level simply don't need to be getting money from the government. And a lot of it is churn, of course. Those people are on very high tax rates, marginal tax rates. They're paying money to the government and then they're getting it back. I think a lot of that sort of spending just doesn't make sense and should be looked at more carefully. But as I said earlier, there are always winners and losers. A lot of spending on public infrastructure, I think, is sometimes a bit grandiose and isn't necessarily productive spending. On the other hand, sometimes spending that's in retrospect seems like it was a waste of money was a good idea at the time, so it can be difficult to tell. I think in the more basic the infrastructure investing, probably the better. If you look at a country like Singapore, they've made massive investments in really basic infrastructure, things like transport, communication technology and so on, and then sort of stepped back and said, okay, now let the private sector decide what's the best way to use those facilities that have been put in place. I think one of the things that all governments are prone to is picking winners, trying to make investments where they think they know better. Often that doesn't end well. But no, I think that there can be good spending and bad spending. Sometimes it's only apparent in retrospect. But putting things through really rigorous cost-benefit analysis before it's done, and that's the kind of work that places like Grattan do, I think should be essential on every project. The other thing I think is for recurring type spending, it should always come with a sunset clause. So you put in place a new program of public spending on some initiative. After 5 years, it will automatically stop unless a rigorous analysis is done that concludes it's worked and was delivering and it's worth continuing. That way the inertia doesn't just keep the thing going, and you don't have vested interests who are happy to just see things continue rolling on, because there's a diffuse group of people who aren't so happy about it, but it's not worth their while to get together and agitate and try and stop it. So I think there's things government can do in terms of how spending generally is policed, for want of a better word, that they should be doing more of.
And Danielle, I think as we discussed things before we've met today, you've made the point, which is an interesting one, that as communities and populations grow richer, they paradoxically seem to accelerate expectations from government in things like healthcare and those areas, which sounds like a bit of a paradox. You'd think that a more wealthy population would probably have the impulse to want to fund things themselves rather than rely on the public purse to fund it. Am I rightly interpreting your point?
Look, it comes about for a slightly different reason, which is as countries get richer, they tend to consume less as a share of income in terms of goods and more in the terms of services. And the types of services people particularly value as they grow their income are things like health services. They want, better quality, longer lives. Very understandable, I think, to all of us in this room. That is a very natural impulse. So those sort of services are what we call kind of luxury goods. As we get richer, we want more of them as a share of income. It just happens that those are the services that government largely provides and underwrites. So that's partly where that shift in expectation comes from. And when we look around the world, this universally holds true. As countries get richer, they spend a higher share of their economy on health services. So we should expect to see health services creep up as a share of the budget. That's not just about population ageing, that is about more and better services per person. As we see new technologies become available, we want them. New interventions, we want to have those. Again, I think that's very understandable community expectation. On your question of how do you balance all those calls on the public purse, I mean, that is ultimately the job of government, right? That's the fundamental thing they do, is take all these competing claims, many of which are meritorious, and trade them off and balance them on our behalf.
But don't you have the issue that governments are on this pretty tight electoral cycle, and even if they know what they could do they have either the courage, the appetite, the sense their focus groups are telling them that this is going to increase their popularity or not? I think over the years we've seen the increasing politicisation of the public service, of most heads of departments now being political appointments rather than career public servants. Is our system fundamentally has got some flaws like that, where it probably can't really answer this question sensibly? Just Danielle, then I'll ask Phil that question.
Look, I don't think it means the system is incapable of answering the question, but it does increase the push towards short-termism and political payoff. So the sort of things that Phil were talking about are putting guardrails in the processes to try and make sure different programs are value for money. I think those are very valuable. We talk a lot about how you can shift governance and institutions to push governments to make better decisions and drive better value for money. And then I think, as a population, we may need to make sure there's an electoral cost to doing those things. So to the extent you are making highly politicised decisions, to the extent that you are undermining institutions by politicising the public service, hopefully that is something that people take into account when they go to the ballot box as well.
Well, I think we'll open that up soon, and we'll learn how informed people feel about these decisions. But Phil, how do we? So do we have a system which is optimum in terms of, if you're wanting to take all of this knowledge into account, all of the understanding we have. You've mentioned putting some time limits on things, having rigorous performance expectations in them, and those things. What else would you change in just if you had your magic wand of changing our society to better take account of all this knowledge?
I think Danielle's point about the short electoral cycle is a very good one. I read a quote once that said a statesman is someone who thinks about the next generation, a politician is someone who thinks about the next election. And we've got a lot of politicians. So it doesn't always lead to long-term decision-making of the kind you would like to see. In terms of trying to fix that, I think having really independent, rigorous advice coming into government from either internally or externally, and it was like the Grattan Institute play are very valuable in that regard. But you need the politicians to be prepared to listen as well. I think it's become more difficult with the shorter news cycle. Social media and so on has certainly not helped in that regard. What I'd like to see is more of a bipartisan view on these are things that both sides probably agree are a good thing, but if each side individually put it up, the other side would seek to tear it down. To be prepared to come together and say, look, we're not going to try and score political capital off this. I think one of the reasons we saw a lot of progress economically during the 80s with Hawke and Keating was that on a lot of the big things, the Liberals and Howard in particular were prepared to back them. And so things got through, a lot of changes that we're still reaping the benefit of, actually, if you look at how the economy was set up during that period. Sadly, I don't think we'll see that again anytime soon. It would be good if we did. It may require a really, and I hope this doesn't happen, a really significant crisis for people to come together. The economy that Hawke and Keating inherited was in pretty bad shape, and that served as a catalyst. They're also fortunate they had a very accomplished salesman, for want of a better word, in Hawke, who was politically personally popular and so on, was able to get things through, who was able to take advice, who was able to make a case. Would be nice to think we'll get back to that sometime soon.
It just comes back to I suppose my contrast, is this science or is it art? Because it sounds like there is there's an evidence base underneath what happens, but there's a fair bit of the art of convincing, human confidence in each other that people like us bring to the decisions that we make. And I can sort of see it probably largely works pretty well, but it also has that opportunity of some things, a lot of people being convinced, and often out of things like self-interest, which is often what we understand looking in the mirror as the motivation we most respond to politically. So let's go to the actual specifics of what we think. Danielle, you can be treasurer for a day or a week or a year or a whole term. What's your priorities that would make the best difference to our society?
Well, if you ask it that way, I'm going to just suggest spending more. So I'll answer it through the lens of I'm going to be a very fiscally disciplined treasurer. So I'm not just going to go out and spend more, because I think, we've already talked about there are many very worthwhile areas for new spending. I think there's no question about that. One thing I would spend more on, and would be my first priority if I was federal treasurer, would be greater support for working age welfare payments, job seeker and other payments. I just think that to me is a clear and burning priority that needs to be addressed. But we've put out a lot of suggestions about what the government could do to deal with this fiscal challenge as well. Phil talked about infrastructure spending. Both transport, infrastructure and defence procurement would be very high on my list. I think they're areas that have become highly politicised. I think they're areas where we've made a lot of bad decisions and they've been extraordinarily costly. So in a way, what I'm saying there is put these controls in place so that we stop doing stupid things. And that would be probably the single biggest thing you could do that would make a difference to budgets. I would also look at the tax base. I would try and start the conversation with the population about, we have these expectations. Yes, we do think we should spend more on aged care. We are trying to support people with a disability, and we're going to need to increase taxes. How do we do that in a way that is fair across the population? So I would be particularly looking at things like income tax concessions, which have become bigger and a sort of a leaky part of the tax base over time. So superannuation tax concessions, negative gearing, the capital gains tax. I think they should all be part of the conversation. We might talk about the GST, and really explaining to people, we understand nobody wants to pay more taxes, but if we want to have the services that we expect as a population, we are going to need to increase revenue by a bit, and that means everyone making a bigger contribution over time.
And that's in a sense the risk of us getting the benefit of resource prices that rise beyond expectations. So, a federal government will set certain things, and the iron ore price or the coal price, in Western Australia or Queensland rises beyond those expectations, and there's windfall benefits. We're in, we're not a unique economy, but we've got some pretty contrasting kind of features running. You've got resources which are pretty elementary to an economy, and then you've got services which are increasingly costly, but in a way disconnected. But Phil, what's your reform and what's your priorities you'd bring?
I think I'd try and send a message by making some, in dollar terms, very small but symbolic changes. As I said, I think a lot of the government spending is effectively middle class welfare. So funding the arts, for instance, to put on a production that people wouldn't pay money to see. Most people wouldn't pay money to see, but they get subsidised to do it. And it's sort of challenging and edgy, and that's and you could argue that that's, you know, contributing to the sort of benefit of society. My guess is the vast majority of the benefit of the society don't get any benefit out of that. It's a very concentrated group of people. You know, an 18-year-old who's just got his first job and working as an apprentice and so on, I don't think gets much comfort from knowing that the opera is subsidised at the Sydney Opera House, for instance. But that kind of thing happens. And I think that kind of spending, I mentioned earlier Hawke and Keating. I should have also added Peter Walsh, who was the finance minister at the time, who was just absolutely rigorous in terms of spending. And I think things like that, the dollar amounts involved are really quite small. But I think they set an expectation and send a message that every dollar that gets spent is coming out of someone's pocket somewhere. Even if it's been borrowed, it's got to be repaid at some point. And applying that sort of rigorous, you know, if the market wouldn't pay for this, why are we paying for it instead? And there could be very good answers to that. But that question should be asked. It might be we're providing a public good, like a road, but private toll roads exist. It might be we're providing education through school, but private schools exist. There could be still reasons for the government to invest in those things because society generally would underinvest left to its own resources. But I think there are plenty of areas where the money is going to a very small group who really don't need it at the end of the day. And so I'd be looking very hard at examples of that, winding them back to the extent I could, even if it means some groups are going to kick and scream, and send a message that from now on, we're going to look very hard at every dollar that gets spent.
We'll soon turn to our friends who are here in the tiered seating, but I just want to ask you, a phrase that's been kicked around a bit at the moment is stage 3 tax cuts, which people know the phrase, what you know, the implication, but it seems like these are tax cuts for people at the higher rates of taxation, and they were staged over a period of 4 or 5 years by the previous government. For all the reasons that you'd want to stage that. But just get both of your views quickly on that concept, because that's probably something we're hearing and we'll hear a bit more thrown around.
Sure. I mean, those tax cuts were put into place in the pre-COVID world, 2018-19 budget, and you know, I think they were designed, frankly, for a very different fiscal and economic environment than we are today. So they do give, they are weighted towards the upper end, as you say. You know, people earning more than $200,000 a year will receive, I think, an $8,000 tax cut when they come into effect in 24-25. You know, that will only be a few $100s if you're a sort of middle income earner on $45,000, $50,000 a year. You know, all tax cuts end up giving more to people on the top end in dollar terms, but also they are quite weighted in percentage terms as well. I think they are too large for the world that we are in. You do need to give some tax cuts over time because of, you know, you hear about bracket creep, which is basically as inflation contributes to our wage rises, we all end up paying higher average tax rates over time. And that is simply the effects of inflation. So if we didn't do anything, your average tax rate would creep up through no fault of your own. So periodically governments do give tax cuts to address bracket creep, but I think they could do that by cutting the size of the stage 3 package. And we've made very specific suggestions about how you would do that. It would reduce the cost by about 1/3. It would essentially just cut the size of tax cuts right at the top end for those earning more than $120,000 a year. And we think that that would be a better balancing, reducing the fiscal burden of that package, reducing the inflationary impact of that package, still giving some tax cuts to compensate for bracket creep. So that is what I would like to see the government do. It's become a very difficult one. Of course, the government said at the election that it would commit to those tax cuts. I think it could have come out earlier and just said, look, you know, that was a different world. We now have high inflation. The budget problem is worse than we realised. But the fact that they haven't done that, I think, makes it increasingly difficult politically, and it would be seen as a broken promise.
Well, Phil, any view on this?
Yeah, I agree. I think, as we said earlier, the problem is that changing. We are in a different world, but going back on that would now be seen as a broken promise. The opposition would be all over them, the press would be all over them, so it makes it just that much more difficult. It'd be nice to think we live in a world in which a government could say, look, we know we said this, the circumstances have changed. It's the classic quote attributed to John Maynard Keynes, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And yeah, we are in a different world. Sadly, one in which the world we're in is sadly one in which trying to reason, for want of a better word, with the opposition, with the media, with the public about the fact that the world is different and promises we made, unfortunately, we're not allowed to deliver, can't deliver on. We only have to remember the heat John Howard took over core and non-core promises, for example, make it that much more difficult. And I definitely agree on the bracket creep issue. I think I'd be happy to see the government say, look, we're going to completely change the way tax rates are set to allow for bracket creep, because, as Danielle said, that it's, in real terms you're paying more tax because your salary's gone up just due to inflation. Some other countries do that. It would be, in the words of Yes Prime Minister, it would be a politically courageous decision to commit to that here. It'd be nice to think it would happen. So I think in terms of these actual stage 3 tax cuts, I think they're probably now pushing against the Reserve Bank along the lines because you're putting more money back into the economy at a time when they're trying to pull it out. That alone for me would be reason to take stock of whether they're now still a good idea in the current environment we're in.
So I might invite Deborah to come back to the podium and hear the kind of questions you'd like to see opened and explored.
Thank you, Archbishop.
Thank you, Malcolm Tadgell. I'm interested in the role of superannuation funds in taking pressure off the public purse. Should governments and us all as members of these funds expect the funds to take greater responsibility for investing in areas such as essential economic infrastructure, including social housing stock?
I'm just going to gather some questions together. Yes, up the back there in the middle.
Ken DeBart. My question is on taxation, and you've pointed to that. It seems to me, from my limited view, that taxation is going to be the fundamental issue in growing the pie. So can you tell us what tax reform should take place? We've had lots of investigations and reports. Ken Henry report, I recall, was seen to be one of the greatest, but not implemented. So what sort of things should we expect for good tax reform to grow the pie and do the things we've always wanted to do?
Thank you. And then the back there.
Chris White. My question's about superannuation. I chair an industry superannuation fund, and our responsibility is to focus primarily, in fact solely, on the best interests of members, and that's interpreted in the law as best financial interests. So rules for requiring superannuation funds to invest in worthy causes which may or may not have as good an investment return run counter to that. We had that type of environment decades ago where insurance companies were required to invest proportions of their funds in government stock. And it was abolished for those sorts of reasons that it's counterproductive. I'd like to hear Phil and Danielle's comments on that type of suggestion.
So 2 questions around superannuation and also around what tax funding should take place.
So so superannuation. It's a bit hard for me to imagine that just on the government side, having these enormous pots of money, that doesn't look so. That would look very tempting if I was a politician to think I could dip in a bit, and the self-funded retirees could take a bit of a clip of their expectation and so on. So, but you've 2 specific questions about, I suppose, broadly Malcolm's was about the social responsibility and can these funds, which are enormous investors, and then the point about the constraint of what they're there for. You got some views on the superannuation side of the story?
Yes, I do, and you're right, it is incredibly tempting to politicians. We've heard a lot of talk about, in areas like social housing, what might be the role of super funds in supplementing government investment. I believe that the duties of superannuation funds in terms of the best financial interests of the members is the right one, and it should remain that. I don't think this is the government's money. I think super funds should be very much focused on investment returns for their members. The government, if they want super funds to be involved in social housing, which we know does not deliver an economic return to members, then they're going to have to offer a top-up or some kind of contribution payment to make that worthwhile for superannuation funds. Which then begs the question to me, if you're going to do that, what is the advantage in superannuation funds doing that investment versus governments doing themselves? So I think it's talked about in the debate as if it's this magical pot of money. It should be left alone by governments. I think super funds should absolutely continue to make the best investment choices for their members, and governments should spend money providing the services that they need to provide for the population. I don't think in any way it is a get-out-of-jail-free card for governments in terms of the services that they need to pay for.
It's interesting because in a previous conversation here before COVID, we were talking about housing, and one of the points made was that there are institutional and long-term investors like superannuation funds that if, say, the states abolished land tax, say, for the housing, it would be a more favourable environment. So, it's a bit as if
if there are impediments to them making these investments.
You've got policy of different layers of government that... Yeah.
And I mean, the key barrier to institutional investment in housing in terms of tax arrangements is the fact that it's progressive land tax. Which means it pushes us towards a world where people own 1 or 2 properties as opposed to 100 or 200 properties, and there's many good reasons why you might want institutional investment in housing. And you're right, so to the extent government is put in place barriers to that sort of investment, they should look at those and adjust them. But what I'm saying is we shouldn't require super funds to do things that are not in the financial interests of their members.
And Phil, you want to take the tax question on?
I think what was interesting was when Ken Henry was asked to do a review of the tax system. It was once it was going to be a complete root and branch tax analysis of the tax system, but not the GST, because no politician wanted to touch it. And I think that was a pity because you can't look at just some aspects of the system and not all of it. And as I said earlier, most economists would agree, by world standards, the GST is low in Australia. And there are all kinds of reasons why it could be increased, particularly with an ageing population. You want to put more tax on spending rather than income if you've got fewer people who are working and so on. So I think a proper analysis of the tax system would take all that into account. Look around the world. What's the world's best practice in terms of tax systems? We have some attractive features of our system here, but I think we could also learn from other countries that maybe do things better. We've got a lot of inefficient taxes here. The GST, when it was brought in, was meant to clean some of those up. I don't think it ever really did to the extent that it was supposed to. If I could just address Chris's question, Chris is an old friend. On the superannuation question, I was once asked to give a talk on the risks of superannuation. And the take I took was it's not investment risk, it's not credit risk, it's not liquidity risk, it's none of those things. The risk you have in superannuation is that you have a 40 to 50 year commitment and no one else, the government, the investment managers, the super funds themselves, no one else has anything like that as their decision-making horizon. If everybody else was taking the same long-term view you were, I think the system would work much better. And you're right, that the government's, it's a big pool of money that's very hard to resist keeping their hands off. And then the concern I have with that is I'd be much less concerned about that, except the fact that once you put your money in with a current set of rules into a superannuation fund, you can't take it out. Government changes the rules, and that's why you get a lot of arguments about whether changes are going to be retrospective or not. Because people in good faith invested their money in a certain set of rules and circumstances, those rules change, but the money still has to sit there. I think agree with Danielle's point earlier, the tax breaks around superannuation are probably excessive. if it's compulsory, you don't need to offer such a big carrot to get people to put their money in. That'd be one of the things I would be looking at in terms of tax reform on the question.
And I think, in the end of the day, all of these, money is not like water in a dam. It really only, its value is only what the real economy will indicate it to be. So if you've got, rampant inflation, you've got other things happening, a very long-term investment and a number on your, probably now on your iPhone screen is only as good as what the real economy at the time you want to use that says it is worth. And we know, I think the whole purpose of our fiscal policy in the Reserve Bank is to prevent that kind of Weimar Republic style hyperinflation. But I can remember being in Zimbabwe and just cashing in, I think it was only about 100 Australian dollars, and I got this great wad at the time of Zim dollars they were making, and then the next day, they were worth 20% less than the day before. So that's, like if the real economy is not being managed, all of our expectations in our long-term things seems to me to, doesn't add up to much at all. And so, getting it right in the here and now, and what that real economy will emerge in the future, always strikes me as being the vital thing that we need to work towards.
And you've got to get your macroeconomic settings right, and so we should all thank Phil Lowe as he's doing this difficult work to guard against us becoming Weimar Germany.
We could obviously talk about this for a very long time. I think we have just about enough for 2 questions.
Yes, my question relates to the possibility of both government and superannuation contributing towards a project that would help with growing more forest in plantation so that we move away from old growth forests. It is actually happening with government, but a way to help those who are currently in the country areas transition, but also a way that the education system could contribute to that, with getting primary school children to help with potting up in a practical sense, as well as early high school students actually helping to plant in the highlands, to encourage knowledge of the environment, but also appreciation of the earth that we've been given.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name's Gavin Hansford. We're all the beneficiaries in our society of the labours and goodwill of past generations. With our debt, we're told that it's good to borrow for infrastructure for future generations. Future generations, therefore, are seen as the people who can share the burden of paying for those things. With our democracy, we also have the sense of, with our responsibilities goes the fact that we get representation. I would like to know if you have ideas about how future generations are burdened with a debt but don't have the representation of the decision being made on their behalf. I did like Phil's suggestion that we need more statesmen, but that's my general question. Is there a moral kind of sense that we have to the future generations that we're not really looking after at the moment?
So I think we had the question of the transition from old growth forestry to plantation forestry and sustainable things, and I suppose we've got many transition issues in our society. What's the role of this sort of investment to better manage those transitions, because they affect rural communities, many other places?
Yeah, sure. And I don't know much about the particulars of forestry, so this will be a general statement, but I think one thing we have learned is that government should play a very active role in those transitions for communities. I think we haven't always done that well, and where you leave communities behind, you do see increased dissatisfaction, poverty. Populism is often pointed to as a response to the fact that certain regions and parts of the community have been left behind. So I think the transitional piece is important. I love the idea of school children going out and planting trees and engaging with the environment. I think that sounds absolutely wonderful. But yeah, I think on your question on super funds, I would go back to what I said before. I'm not sure, unless there's a return to super fund members, that it's a role for super funds, but I think absolutely it is a role for government to play.
I think I agree that there's a role for government there. I didn't mention this earlier, but I think another role government can play is to act as a catalyst to get you out of a catch-22 situation. So, for example, a lot more people would buy electric cars if there were a lot more charging stations. But until a lot of people buy electric cars, it's not worth putting the charging stations in. So you're sort of stuck in this bad equilibrium. Maybe the government can have a role there as a catalyst to say, we'll fund enough charging stations to be worth people's while to buy an electric car and know they're not going to suddenly find the car runs out of battery. And so it can act as a catalyst in that situation where the private sector, for perfectly sensible reasons, or a superannuation fund, or whatever, wouldn't do it because economically it's not viable. So the government can have a role where it steps in to do that. And the environment could be another example of that. I once read a survey of famous Australian historians who were asked what were the 3 biggest mistakes in Australian history. If you could rewind history and not make them, what were they? And number 1 on that list was the introduction of rabbits, because of what they did to the environment, given that no native enemies and so on. Just by the by, number 2 was getting involved in the Vietnam War, and number 3 was Canberra. The notion of a separate purpose-built capital, not miles from anywhere and so on. And as people probably know, one of the reasons Canberra is where it is, it was located far enough inshore that it couldn't be shelled from the ocean by warships during a war. So I think there is a role there in terms of the environment as well. And also managing the transition. As you move away from fossil fuels, coal mining in particular, some of those little towns, you shut the coal mine down, you shut the town down. And the value of the houses in that town are going to drop through the floor because there's no other industry and so on. So I think there's a role there for government to step in and say, the private sector wouldn't touch this. We think it's a change worth making, and we're prepared to step up and do it. So I think there is a role there for government to play, to act as a catalyst in some sense, to step in when other players wouldn't.
And Gavin's question?
It's an incredibly important question, and I think we absolutely have a moral duty to future generations. And something that I've written about and thought a lot about is, we've actually had an expectation that each generation will be better off than the one before. That has been the norm over all of our lifetimes. I am not sure that is true for the next generation. Both in an economic sense, we've talked about debt today, but I look at what's going on in housing markets, for example. It is just not within reach for many young people today to have a home or to buy a home. When I look at what's happening to the environment and climate change, I fear we are not leaving a better world for our children than the one we inherited, and that does disturb me greatly.
Yeah, I agree. I think intergenerational transfers and transferring obligations onto a future generation is something you should think long and hard about before you do it. In fact, it even applies within an individual. I once read a thing about managing your time, which said if you're asked to commit to go to a meeting, going to an event, doing something in the future, it's not your current self that's going to have to turn up and deliver on that, it's your future self. And your future self isn't sitting in the room saying, hang on, I don't think that's a good idea. In 6 months' time, I'm not going to be so happy that you committed me to do that. So I think thinking ahead, what is it we're imposing on people who aren't in the room with us, particularly if they're not even born yet? Will they look back and say, what were they thinking? Why did they impose the costs on us when they got the benefits? And again, a good, rigorous policy-making framework would be taking that into account. Costs and benefits, not just today, but in future. And again, it's one of the reasons why I'm a fan of sort of sunset clauses. If something's not working, pull the plug on it. Don't let the inertia just keep it going and imposing the costs on people who weren't in the room at the time the original decision was made.
Thank you.
Sadly, our time is over. Can I thank you all for being here this morning for this very rich conversation, and we look forward to greeting you the next time, the next Archbishop's conversation later in the year. And can I ask you please to thank our guests, along with Archbishop Philip, to Danielle and to Phil. Thank you so much.